More than 60 years have passed since Perry Mason first strode into an American courtroom and changed television forever. And the people who stood beside him, against him, and behind him lived lives that no viewer at home in 1957 could possibly have imagined. One of them was fired from the show in a scandal so explosive that his name was stripped from the credits, and it took a personal campaign by his co-star to bring him back. Another had played 900 stage roles before most viewers ever saw his face, and quietly faded from the screen as his lungs failed him, while the producers kept his name in the opening titles so he could keep his health insurance. A third spent years constructing elaborate false biographies about himself, inventing dead wives and lost children, because the truth of who he really was could have ended his career overnight. One of them came to acting entirely by accident, having originally set out to write screenplays, and ended up as one of the most familiar faces in American primetime for 3 decades. And one had been a celebrated Hollywood actress in more than 60 films before walking away from the cameras entirely, and then quietly built the show from scratch, becoming the only female executive producer in American primetime television for 9 consecutive years. This is what happened to the cast of Perry Mason. He was the face of institutional law in Perry Mason's world, steady, dry-witted, perpetually skeptical, perpetually outmaneuvered. Lieutenant Arthur Tragg appeared in the very first episode of the series in 1957 and became one of the most recognizable figures in American television drama. The man behind him, Ray Collins, was 67 years old when filming began. He came to the role carrying a biography so rich and so unusual that Perry Mason was almost a footnote in it, and yet it would be the thing most people remembered. Ray Bidwell Collins was born on December 10, 1889, in Sacramento, California, the son of a newspaper drama editor on the Sacramento Bee. His great-grandfather was John Bidwell, founder of some of the earliest organized society in the Sacramento Valley. He started acting at age 13 at the Liberty Playhouse in Oakland, and by his early 20s, he had established his own theatrical stock company in Vancouver, British Columbia. He spent decades on the Broadway stage and accumulated, over the course of his career, more than 900 individual stage roles. That number alone places him in a category almost no other American actor has ever occupied. In the mid-1930s, something happened that would define the second act of his career entirely. He became part of Orson Welles' Mercury Theater Company. Welles himself described Collins as the finest actor he had ever worked with. Collins was the voice of the radio announcer in the 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast that sent a significant portion of the American public into genuine panic. He was boss Jim Geddes in Citizen Kane in 1941. He appeared in The Magnificent Ambersons. He was part of Touch of Evil. He appeared in more than 75 films over a career that spanned the entire classical Hollywood era. By 1957, Ray Collins was a man of enormous professional stature and virtually no household name recognition. That changed to a degree with Perry Mason. Lieutenant Tragg, his wide-brimmed hat, his flat stare, his air of perpetually resigned exasperation at Mason's ability to overturn what had seemed like certain convictions, became beloved by millions of viewers. But Collins himself was already in decline. By 1960, emphysema had begun its work. His memory, once so reliable that he could memorize 80 pages of text in 8 hours, began to fail him. His wife spent hours each evening cueing his lines at home. By late 1963, he filmed his final episode. And then something happened that says more about the Perry Mason cast than almost any fact in this entire story. Raymond Burr insisted that Collins' name remain in the opening credits even after he could no longer appear. This was done partly to keep his spirits up, and partly, critically, to ensure that he continued to receive health coverage through the Screen Actors Guild. On July 11, 1965, Ray Collins died of emphysema at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica at the age of 75. His ashes, at his own request, were scattered at sea. A man who had given the stage, radio, and screen 6 decades of genuine mastery, and whose final credit on Perry Mason was an act of friendship from a co-star, not his own work on camera. When Ray Collins could no longer stand in front of a camera, someone had to step into the vacuum he left. And the man who did it had never intended to act at all. Wesley Lau arrived on Perry Mason in 1961 as Lieutenant Andy Anderson, the police detective who gradually absorbed the duties that Colin's failing health made impossible for Tragg to fulfill. He was 36 years old when the show first aired in 1957, and 40 years old at the time of his first appearance in the role. He made 81 episodes over the following 4 years, and the way he got there says something true about the difference between the people who plan their lives and the people who simply pay close attention to what happens next. Thus, Wesley Albert Lau was born on June 18, 1921, in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. He grew up during the Depression, graduated from Central High School in 1939, and went on to the University of Wisconsin, where his declared goal was to become a playwright, not an actor. After military service in the U.S. Army Air Forces during World War II, he returned and earned a Master of Arts degree from the Yale School of Drama, then continued on to the Actors Studio in New York, still in pursuit of writing, still convinced that was the work he was meant to do. But New York had other ideas. When he arrived seeking employment as a playwright, the acting jobs came first. He had the tools, the training, the physical authority, and the theater was willing to pay him to use them. By the mid-1950s, he was working steadily in television. Alfred Hitchcock presents Gunsmoke, Have Gun, Will Travel, The Twilight Zone. He appeared in the Susan Hayward film I Want to Live in 1958, and in John Wayne's The Alamo in 1960. His first appearance on Perry Mason was as a defendant in a 1961 episode, and the producers thought enough of what they saw to bring him back almost immediately in the recurring role that would define his television career. Lieutenant Andy Anderson was not a flashy character. He was methodical, fair, professionally correct, the kind of police detective who could coexist in the same frame as Perry Mason without being made to look foolish. He also continued to write. His most notable screenplay credit was the 1975 gangster film Lepke, starring Tony Curtis, demonstrating that the original ambition had never really gone away. On August 30th, 1984, Wesley Lau died of heart failure in Los Angeles, California, at the age of 63. He was buried at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills Cemetery. A man who came to acting looking for something else, and found, in the quiet authority of Lieutenant Andy Anderson, exactly the right place to put what he had. The final season of Perry Mason introduced a third police detective, Lieutenant Steve Drum, played by a man whose career was about to take a turn that nobody at CBS in 1965 could have predicted. Richard Anderson was 30 years old when Perry Mason premiered in 1957, and 38 years old when he joined the cast for the show's 9th and final season, appearing in 24 episodes as a no-nonsense detective who functioned as the procedural anchor of a courtroom drama in its closing chapter. But Perry Mason was, for Anderson, simply one more entry in a catalog of work that stretched in almost every direction American television pointed, and it would eventually be followed by the role that made him genuinely famous. A role that millions of viewers born after 1970 know by 2 words: Oscar Goldman. Richard Norman Anderson was born on August 8, 1926, in Long Branch, New Jersey. All 4 of his grandparents were Russian Jewish immigrants who had built their lives in America from very little. He served in the United States Army during World War II, and afterward enrolled at the Actors Laboratory Theater in Los Angeles. He began his career in the mailroom at MGM, not in front of a camera, but behind the machinery that made the studio run, and worked his way into a contract as a screen actor in 1950. His early film work was substantial. Scaramouche, Escape from Fort Bravo, with William Holden, Forbidden Planet in 1956. Then came Paths of Glory in 1957, directed by Stanley Kubrick, one of cinema's most devastating anti-war dramas. These were not footnotes in a forgettable career. Television became his primary medium. The range of programs that carry his name in their credits across the 1960s reads like a map of the era's entire primetime landscape. The Untouchables, The Rifleman, Combat, Bonanza, The Man from UNCLE, The Wild Wild West. In the series finale of The Fugitive in 1967, one of the most watched episodes in American television history, he played Richard Kimball's brother-in-law and was briefly considered a suspect in the murder that had defined the entire series. After Perry Mason ended in 1966, Anderson's career entered its defining chapter. In 1974, he was cast as Oscar Goldman, the calm, sharp director of the Office of Strategic Intelligence, in The $6 Million Man. He played the character through the entire run of that series and then simultaneously on the spin-off, The Bionic Woman, from 1976 to 1978, making him one of the very few actors in television history to carry the same regular character on two different series at once. For a generation of American children, the voice that intoned the opening of The $6 Million Man, "We have the technology, we can rebuild him," was as familiar as any sound in their household. Anderson later returned for 3 reunion television movies and produced 2 of them himself. Richard Anderson died on August 31st, 2017, in Los Angeles, California, at the age of 91. The mailroom clerk from MGM, who appeared in Kubrick's masterpiece, passed through Perry Mason in its final season, and went on to define 2 science fiction series for a generation of American children. That is a career that deserves to be read slowly. Every week for 9 years, he walked into that courtroom and lost. Hamilton Berger, the district attorney who argued every case with absolute conviction and watched Perry Mason dismantle him, almost without exception, before the closing credits. It became such a reliable outcome that Talman himself once called it the longest losing streak in the history of the legal profession. But what nobody watching at home understood was that the man playing that role was fighting battles off-screen that made Hamilton Berger's courtroom defeats look insignificant. William Whitney Talman Jr. was born on February 4, 1915, in Detroit, Michigan, the son of a wealthy businessman whose money was enough, as Talman told TV Guide years later, to send him to school in a limousine each day. Public school, which meant, he added, that he had to fight his way in and out. He was 42 years old when Perry Mason began filming in 1957. Before that, he had studied at Dartmouth and the University of Michigan, worked at iron foundries and paper mills, and served 30 months in the U.S. Army in the Pacific Theater during World War II. His breakthrough came in 1953 with The Hitchhiker, a film noir directed by Ida Lupino in which Talman played a sadistic escaped murderer. The New York Times called it one of the year's juiciest assignments. Executive producer Gail Patrick Jackson saw the film and decided immediately that she wanted Talman for Hamilton Berger. Raymond Burr had originally auditioned for the prosecutor's role himself, not Mason's. But once Burr was redirected toward the lead, the part was Talman's. He made it something that should not have worked at all. A television character defined by losing should not be watchable for 9 years. Talman made him watchable by playing Berger as a man who genuinely believed he was right every single time, which made his defeats feel like genuine tragedy rather than predictable formula. In March of 1960, sheriff's deputies raided a Hollywood party at which Talman was present. Reports included claims of nudity and marijuana use. All charges were eventually dismissed for lack of proof, but CBS fired Talman immediately for violating the morality clause in his contract. What followed was a campaign led by Raymond Burr, who organized letter writing by the cast and refused to let the show continue as if nothing had happened. CBS reinstated Talman after 7 episodes. The solidarity of that moment was, by all accounts, genuine and total. After Perry Mason ended in 1966, Talman toured Vietnam for 6 weeks entertaining American troops. When he returned, the diagnosis was waiting for him: lung cancer, already advanced. What he did with the time that remained took genuine courage. Gaunt, visibly dying, reportedly under heavy sedation during filming, he agreed to appear in an anti-smoking public service announcement for the American Cancer Society. He was the first celebrity in American history to do so. He insisted the commercial not be aired until after his death. It began, "Before I die, I want to do what I can to leave a world free of cancer for my 6 children." Then came the words that millions of viewers would not forget: "I've got lung cancer." So, take some advice about smoking and losing from someone who's been doing both for years. Don't be a loser. William Talman died on August 30th, 1968, at the age of 53. The man who lost every case left, in the end, the most lasting argument of his life. He was the most connected man in Hollywood, who spent a decade actively trying to be anything other than a Hollywood actor. Paul Drake, blonde, laconic, endlessly reliable, the private investigator who did the legwork that Perry Mason turned into courtroom gold, was played by a man whose very name was a map of the industry he claimed not to care about. His mother was Hedda Hopper. His father was DeWolf Hopper. He grew up in the most gossip-saturated household in Los Angeles, and his response to it was to spend 9 years after World War II selling cars. William DeWolf Hopper Jr. was born on January 26, 1915, in New York City, the only child of two of the most theatrical figures of their era. His father, the legendary Broadway performer DeWolf Hopper, was 57 years old when William was born. His mother, Hedda, would eventually become one of the most feared gossip columnists in Hollywood history. He was 42 years old when Perry Mason began in 1957. He had started his career in the early 1930s at his mother's insistence under the name Wolf Hopper. He was signed by Paramount at 20 and appeared in second features and supporting roles throughout the late 1930s. Then came the war. He served as a Navy frogman performing underwater demolition operations in the South Pacific, work so dangerous it was said that the stress permanently turned his hair white. He earned the Bronze Star with valor. When he came home in 1945, he walked away from acting and did not return for nearly 9 years. He sold cars. He was good at it. The career of a working actor did not seem to him like something worth fighting for. What brought him back was a gradual re-entry through film in the mid-1950s, Rebel Without a Cause in 1955, where he played Natalie Wood's father, The Bad Seed in 1956, 20 Million Miles to Earth in 1957, and then the audition for Perry Mason, in which he walked in and, before reading a line, blurted out to executive producer Gail Patrick Jackson, "You hate my mother." She did not. But the remark was entirely in character for a man who had spent his adult life navigating the shadow of Hedda Hopper's reputation. Jackson cast him anyway, immediately, because he was, as she recalled, simply perfect as Paul Drake. When Perry Mason ended in 1966, Hopper declined every subsequent television offer that came to him. He had given his professional commitment entirely to one show, and when it was over, he was finished. He made one final film appearance, uncredited, in Myra Breckenridge in 1970, a film that premiered 3 months after his death. He suffered a stroke on Valentine's Day 1970 and died of a heart attack in Palm Springs, California on March 6, 1970, at the age of 55. He had never truly wanted the life he had, and never entirely escaped it either. That paradox followed him to the end. She never played a single character on Perry Mason. Her name did not appear in the opening titles the way Raymond Burr's or Barbara Hale's did. And yet, without her, the show almost certainly does not exist. Gail Patrick Jackson was the executive producer of Perry Mason from the first episode to the last. And she was, during those 9 years, the only female executive producer in all of American primetime television. She was 46 years old when the show premiered in September 1957. She had already lived 2 entirely separate professional lives, and she had built the second one herself, from scratch, in a room where women were not supposed to be sitting. She was born Margaret Lavelle Fitzpatrick on June 20th, 1911, in Birmingham, Alabama, president of her senior class, member of the debating society. Someone who understood how power worked even before life had given her the tools to reach it. She enrolled at Howard College, eventually joined the faculty, and rose to become Dean of Women. She studied pre-law at the University of Alabama. Then she entered a nationwide talent search, sponsored by Paramount Pictures, for a role in the 1932 horror film Island of Lost Souls. She did not win, but she tested opposite Gary Cooper, negotiated her contract up from $50 to $75 a week, and found herself under contract to one of the largest studios in Hollywood before she had turned 21. For the next 15 years, she appeared in more than 60 films. She was repeatedly cast as the bad girl, the other woman, the sophisticated schemer. My Man Godfrey in 1936, opposite William Powell and Carole Lombard. Stage Door in 1937. My Favorite Wife in 1940, with Cary Grant and Irene Dunne. She was consistently the most interesting person in the frame. In 1939, she played a female attorney in a film called Disbarred, a fact that, in retrospect, carries a certain irony. In 1947, she married Cornwell Jackson, the literary agent for Earle Stanley Gardner, creator of Perry Mason. Gardner had refused for years to license his character for further adaptations. Gail Patrick Jackson won him over. She understood the law, she understood storytelling, and she understood, with the practical intelligence of a woman who had spent 15 years navigating a business that treated her as a supporting player, how to build something from a difficult starting point. She, her husband, and Gardner formed Paisano Productions, with Patrick as president. She negotiated with CBS herself. She wrote a contract so favorable to Paisano Productions that, as one CBS executive recalled decades later, she could not believe CBS had agreed to it. She cast Raymond Burr as Perry Mason at a moment when most of the production staff was doubtful. She cast William Talman as Hamilton Berger after seeing him in a single film noir. She brought in Barbara Hale, William Hopper, and Ray Collins. She oversaw every creative decision across 9 seasons as the only woman in that position anywhere in American prime time. She weathered the Talman scandal of 1960 with the institutional calm of someone who had learned to be the only woman in every room she entered. After the show ended in 1966, she attempted a revival, the new Perry Mason in 1973, with Monty Markham in the title role. It ran 15 episodes and failed. She divorced Cornwell Jackson in 1969 and married her 4th husband in 1974. For the last 4 years of her life, she was quietly treated for leukemia, a diagnosis she kept entirely to herself. She told no one but her husband. On July 6, 1980, Gail Patrick Jackson died at her Hollywood home, at the age of 69. The woman who had built Perry Mason from a contract negotiation and a conviction that Raymond Burr was the right actor for the part did not see it named after her. She did not need to. She knew what she had made. She was the conscience of the show, not its subject, not its engine, but its steady, intelligent, quietly authoritative center. The person without whom Perry Mason's world made no emotional sense. Della Street, Mason's confidential secretary, was not a passive figure and never played as one. She was competent, observant, and fiercely loyal, and she functioned as the human warmth that made Raymond Burr's formidable Mason something an audience could lean toward rather than simply admire. Barbara Hale was 35 years old when the show began in 1957, and she had been thinking about retiring from acting before the call came. Barbara Hale was born on April 18, 1922, in DeKalb, Illinois, the daughter of a landscape gardener. She moved to Rockford as a child and graduated from Rockford High School in 1940, where she was voted May Queen her senior year. She planned to be an artist and enrolled at the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts. Modeling for a comic strip called Ramblin' Bill paid her tuition. By 1943, she was in Hollywood, under contract to RKO Radio Pictures, moving through a string of films that built a solid career without quite making her a star. She appeared in The Window in 1949, in The Jackpot opposite James Stewart in 1950, in A Lion Is, in The Streets with James Cagney in 1953. At RKO, she had become close friends with Raymond Burr, and it was partly that friendship, along with her relationships with the show's producers, that brought her to Perry Mason at the precise moment she was considering stepping back from the industry entirely. The show was initially promised to run 18 episodes. It ran 271. She appeared in every single one of them. In 1959, she won the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Supporting Actress in a Drama Series. A recognition that she was, episode by episode, doing something genuinely difficult, holding the emotional register of a show in place while the plots revolved around courtroom mechanics and guest star catastrophes. She was known on set for sketching constantly during downtime. The art school ambition never fully faded. She was one of the original Dr. Pepper calendar girls. By multiple accounts, she was the social and emotional center of a cast that spent 9 years in close proximity under significant professional pressure. When Raymond Burr became the highest-paid actor in American television by the end of the series, the show's runaway success owed something to every scene in which Barbara Hale made Mason's intelligence feel like something more than a parlor trick. Her personal life had the stability that several of her co-stars never quite found. In 1946, she married actor Bill Williams, a man she had met on the set of West of the Pecos the previous year. They had 3 children, daughters Jody and Juanita, and a son, William Catt, who became an actor himself and eventually played Detective Paul Drake Jr. alongside his mother in the Perry Mason television movies that began in 1985. Those movies, 30 of them in total, stretching to 1995, represented a second chapter in her professional life that was, by any measure, extraordinary. When Raymond Burr died in 1993, Hale continued on through 4 additional films with other leads. She was the only actor to appear across the entire run of the franchise, from the first CBS episode in 1957 to the final television film in 1995. She outlasted everyone. Bill Williams died of cancer in 1992 after 46 years of marriage. Barbara Hale died on January 26, 2017, at her home in Sherman Oaks, California, at the age of 94, of complications from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. She was the last surviving member of the original Perry Mason cast. Raymond Burr, before his own death, had named an orchid after her. It was, for anyone who knew them, exactly the right gesture. And then there was him, the man at the center of it all. The reason 30 million people tuned in every Saturday night. Perry Mason was a character so thoroughly defined by Raymond Burr's intelligence, physical authority, and peculiar mixture of warmth and implacability that separating the performance from the person has always seemed beside the point. He was 40 years old when the show began in 1957. He had spent the previous decade playing killers, manipulators, and psychopaths across more than 90 films, and had become one of the most effective screen villains in the history of Hollywood. Nobody who saw him in those roles would have predicted Perry Mason. And yet, according to Erle Stanley Gardner himself, who was present at the screen test, the moment Burr read for the part, Gardner stood up, pointed at the screen, and said, "That's Perry Mason." Raymond William Stacy Burr was born on May 21, 1917, in New Westminster, British Columbia, Canada. The eldest of 3 children of a hardware dealer, father, and a mother who was a pianist and music teacher. His parents separated when Raymond was 6, and his mother took him and his siblings to Vallejo, California. During the Great Depression, Burr quit school at 13 to support his family, taking work as a ranch hand, a deputy sheriff, a nightclub singer, a photo salesman. The biography he would later present to the public bore little resemblance to this one, and that discrepancy matters. Over the course of his career, Burr told journalists about a wife who had died in a plane crash, a son who had died of leukemia at age 10, wartime injuries sustained in Okinawa. None of these stories could be independently verified. Many, after his death, appeared to be entirely fabricated. The consensus among those who knew him was that he constructed these alternative histories to protect a secret he could not safely tell in the Hollywood of his era. He was gay, and had been in a committed domestic partnership with actor Robert Benavides since meeting him on the Perry Mason set in 1960. Benavides gave up his own acting career in 1963 and became Burr's production consultant, life partner, and ultimately the sole beneficiary of his estate. The false biographies, the invented wives, and dead children were the cost of professional survival in an industry and an era that would not have tolerated the truth. His road to Perry Mason was paved with villainy of the most technically demanding kind. In the 1940s and early 1950s, he appeared in more than 50 film noirs: Desperate, Raw Deal, Pitfall, The Blue Gardenia, Crime of Passion, building an array of antagonists that film historians have since recognized as some of the most psychologically complex work of the genre. Then came Alfred Hitchcock, who cast Burr as the suspected murderer in Rear Window in 1954. He was, in his own words, just a fat heavy. The transition from that to the moral center of a primetime courtroom drama required not just a change of role, but a complete reconstitution of how an audience perceived him. And he accomplished it so thoroughly that within 2 seasons, most viewers had forgotten entirely what he had been before. On screen, none of that weight was visible. Perry Mason became something genuinely rare in American television, a character who never quite lost, in 9 seasons and 271 episodes, any of the moral and intellectual authority he carried in the very first frame. Burr won back-to-back Emmy Awards in 1959 and 1961 for the role. By the early 1960s, 30 million viewers watched him every Saturday night. He was the highest paid actor on American television by the time the show ended in 1966. He went on to play the wheelchair-using chief of detectives Robert Ironside for 8 more seasons on NBC, and in 1985 returned to Perry Mason for a series of television films that became a ratings phenomenon all over again. He made 26 of them before his death. His life away from the screen was organized around the things he genuinely loved: orchids. He developed a business with Benavides that added more than 1,500 new varieties to the worldwide catalog, naming one of them the Barbara Hale orchid. Wine, cooking, sailing, and a vineyard in Sonoma County. He made 10 separate trips to Vietnam to visit American troops, personally meeting 27,000 men and flying over 1,200 hours in military helicopters, including flights under enemy fire. These were not publicity events. In 1992, Burr was diagnosed with kidney cancer. He continued working. He filmed his final Perry Mason movie in the months that followed. He traveled to Europe. On September 12, 1993, Raymond Burr died at his ranch in Sonoma County, California, at the age of 76. Robert Benavides was with him. The man who spent decades telling false stories about himself left, in the end, a legacy of extraordinary honesty on screen. Perry Mason never deceived anyone. The same could be said, in every way that truly mattered, of Raymond Burr. There it is, an entire world that existed just behind the cameras of Perry Mason. A police detective who memorized 900 stage roles and had his name kept in the credits to protect his health insurance. A playwright who became an actor because the acting jobs arrived first and spent 4 years filling the vacancy left by a dying man. An MGM mailroom clerk who appeared in Kubrick's anti-war masterpiece and went on to define 2 science fiction series for an entire generation. A prosecutor who filmed an anti-smoking message while dying, knowing it would run only after his funeral. A private detective who spent 9 years after the war selling cars to avoid the life his famous mother had mapped out for him. The woman who was the only female executive producer in American primetime television for 9 years running and kept her fatal illness as secret as she kept her power, quiet, absolute, and entirely her own. The secretary who outlasted every single one of them. And a lawyer who invented an entire false biography to protect the love of his life from a world that would not have accepted the truth. All of them were more than the roles they played. All of them carried things the camera never quite showed. And all of them are part of one story, about what it costs to stand in a fictional courtroom for 9 years, and what kind of life waits for you on the other side of it. Tell us in the comments, which of these stories surprised you most, and where in the world are you watching from today? If you want to keep finding the real stories behind the classic shows and the people who created them, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell. Every week, we go past the legend and into the life.